atheist and secular organizations in Iowa, Skeptics in the Pub, and Iowa Atheists and Freethinkers, working with the liberal religious community. Sean has been very generous with his time this week. He was at Interfaith Alliance on Friday, and took her to the Israel Synagogue yesterday morning, and now among liberal heathens here. So I will turn it over to Alan Coslow to introduce Sean.
I know about a third of you in the audience, but for those of you who don't know me, I'm a local physician who has been a political rabble-rouser my whole life since I was in junior high school. And I'm the president of the Iowa Skeptics, and I'm a member of Iowa Atheists and Freethinkers, and also a very active member of, probably one of the only people who's a very active member of all 4 Jewish congregations in town. I can't make up my mind. I figured that if I'm in all 4, then I can argue with whoever I'm with, and they just say, "Oh, he's from the other one." But anyway, I'm really very proud to introduce Sean Faircloth. Sean has a very illustrious career, starting with a state senator in Maine, and he was a state senator for a total of 5 terms, 10 years, split with a split in the middle, during which he was the Assistant Attorney General of Maine. While he was in the state legislature, he passed over 30 legislations, and these were actually very significant legislations, including one of the strongest deadbeat bad legislations in the country. And while he was out of the state legislature, he actually was the conceiver, founder, organizer, major fundraiser of the Children's Museum in Maine, which is the 2nd largest children's museum in New England. Since then he left, he became the executive director, left Maine and came to West Washington and became the executive director of the Secular Coalition for America, where he was at for a little over 2 years, and then moved on to be the director of special projects for the Richard Dawkins Foundation. And it was during this stint that I met him, and I invited him to Iowa, and he's going, and not to steal any of his thunder, he's going to tell you what came of that invitation here to Iowa. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Sean. And let me just mention also that at the end we'll have his books available for anybody who would like to purchase them.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, yes, thank you very much, Alan. It's really due to his leadership that I've been spending so much time in the state of Iowa, and why I think it's really central to the future of church-state separation in this country. I spent a lot of time in politics and have seen a lot of the issues both in Washington and in D.C. with regard to church-state separation issues. And from my experience in Maine, I have one perspective. I represented Bangor in the state legislature, so my constituent was Stephen King, who some people think is pretty scary. But here in Iowa, you have Steve King, which I think is scary. Especially because you put congressman in front of Steve King here in Iowa with some pretty scary results. And part of what I write about in my book is how things now seem like standard, accepted, that the religious right, for example, has veto power over one of 2 major political parties in the United States. That's been sort of part of the landscape for us for so many years that we think it's normal, we think it's the way it is. But really, in my book, I kind of document that that's not really true. In fact, as recently as Barry Goldwater, who, for those of you who know your history, was Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative, the leader of the right-wing movement in this country in mid-20th century America. And Barry Goldwater said, and I quote, "I don't have any respect for the religious right." In other words, Barry Goldwater would have 0 chance had he run in 2012 in the Republican primaries. That's how much things have changed, and it really is rather recent. And there's been a dramatic number of laws that have been passed, and I document this in chapter 3 of my book with example after example after example of laws of specific religious bias. The exact thing that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said they did not want. laws with religious bias in them. Now, I used to work as an assistant attorney general doing child protection cases. That is, when a child was in jeopardy in their home, I would be one who would work with the social workers who would get that child to safety, whether it was because of abuse or neglect or medical neglect. And in that context, I want to tell you a story of a girl in the 21st century in the United States of America. And her name was Jessica Crank. And Jessica was 15 years old. And Jessica had a tumor growing on her shoulder. Now, it was a perfectly treatable tumor with modern medical science, except that Jessica's mother did not believe in modern medical science. She believed to heal Jessica with the Epistle of James. And unfortunately, her minister, the mother's minister, could correctly point to a statute in their state that said that if a family believes in so-called faith healing, they will get greater leeway under the child protection law to medically neglect their child. With that assurance from her pastor, the mother did not medically treat her child. And as a result, the tumor on Jessica's shoulder in the 21st century grew and grew and grew until it was literally, not figuratively, literally the size of a basketball on this girl's shoulder. She suffered horrible, agonizing, torturous pain for weeks and weeks, and then she died. Torture far worse than anything that ever happened at Abu Ghraib. Many of you in this room may have protested against what happened at Abu Ghraib. If you did, good for you. But what Jessica Crank suffered was far worse. Where are the protesters for this girl? Where are those speaking out for vulnerable children in our society? And you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's some, right-wing state, maybe that's happening down in Alabama, in that state legislature. 38 states. 38 states have some kind of law that says there's greater leeway, it doesn't make it legal, but there's greater leeway for parents to medically neglect their child based on so-called faith healing. And let's not make any mistake. The phrase faith healing is a lie. It's faith harming, and it is often, and in Jessica's case, it was faith killing. And it is abhorrent to the founding values of America that this should occur. And I want to talk to you, that was just one example, but I want to talk to you about 10 principles, a vision of a secular America that I lay out in my book. Unfortunately, I have to report to you that every single one of the issues that are part of the 10-point vision of a secular America are currently, not at some future time that we're worried about, currently violated in American law today. But this vision, the vision I'm going to present to you, is much more consistent with the values of the founders of this country. Principle number 1, our military shall serve and include all Americans, religious and non-religious, with no hint of bias and no hint of fundamentalist extremism coloring our military decisions at home or abroad. You may be familiar with this young man, Stephen Hill. If you remember the news from a couple of years ago, Stephen Hill was booed at a Republican Tea Party event because he is a gay serviceman. That was abhorrent to our principles as a nation. And I bet there are people in this room who served in the United States military. And I think we owe them a round of applause for their service, gay, straight, religious, or not religious. Let's give them This is in contrast to the way that others treat even our men and women in uniform, and that needs to stop. Principle number 2. Healthcare professionals shall fulfill their ethical and professional duty and oath to address the needs of their patients, and they must do so without the hint of religious bias and in respectful service to the needs of their patients, the patients that they are sworn to serve. Or they must find another job. This is based on a real problem. In the state of Arizona, thanks to the Obama administration, this has now changed on a federal level. But just a few years ago, a young woman in Arizona was raped. And then she went with a valid prescription for Plan B in her hand to a pharmacy. But because of the Arizona state law, the pharmacist could validly say to this young raped woman, "Get thee away from me. I don't accept Plan B. I will not fill your prescription," turned this young woman away. By the time she finally got to a pharmacist who would fill the prescription, it was past the optimum number of hours for use of the Plan B medication. Think of the trauma that this young woman experienced, first with the rape, then on top of that, to be treated with contempt by a healthcare provider. Principle number 3, that any federally funded program, whether state or federal, that has to do with reproductive services, shall be based on decisions of science and not based upon religious bias. This has to stop. Principle number 4, there should be no bias based on religion or lack thereof in land use planning or environmental law or in employment. And unfortunately, I have to report to you that all of that occurs now. Believe it or not, in land use planning, if you have a local law, a local environmental law, because of a federal top-down government mandate, religious groups can exempt themselves from laws that all the rest of us, 501c3 nonprofits, individuals, for-profit businesses, must obey. It's wrong. In employment, with faith-based initiatives, so-called faith-based initiatives, it has in fact happened with your tax dollars that they have said, "Sorry, you're the wrong type of fundamentalist, you're fired. You want to be an accountant with our taxpayer-funded group, but you happen to be a Muslim? No, we will turn you away because you're a Muslim." With tax dollars. That has occurred in this country. It is abhorrent, it is against our basic principles, and we must stand up against it. And of course, principle number 5. Marriage can be defined by any religious group as they so choose for ceremonies within their congregation. We would defend that right, certainly. Under American law, there should be no discrimination based on religion or lack thereof, or definition of marriage that is based upon a religious principle. People of the same sex should be allowed to get married in any civil society based upon equal treatment under the law. Principle number 6. Oh, good. Also, because when we look at these issues, really you got to look at, here's anti-gay crusader Ted Haggard. He's the one who preached against gay sex while having gay sex with men. Yeah. Now I kind of prefer someone like, sorry, something's happening with my our friend George Takei, who has been with his husband since 1987. I think those are more the principles that we support. Next principle is that when facing the end of life, all Americans shall be guaranteed control over their own bodies without being thwarted by religious bodies. Principle number 7. America's youth shall never be subjected to religious bias in education. If there's 1 penny of government funds, there should not be a hint of religious bias or propaganda. Principle number 8. The composition of our Congress and legislature shall include secular Americans, and there must be no political bias against secular candidates. They must be treated equally with other citizens. Principle number 9. There should be and here's what we should look at in terms of our folks in politics, is who we've got now is Mr. Santorum. And I'd like you to contrast that with someone like Bill Gates. And whether you happen to be religious or not religious, Bill Gates happens to not be religious. I would suggest that his way of making decisions, his way of moving through issues, is perhaps a little more principled than we saw from Mr. Santorum, and so that his viewpoint should be included. We have, unfortunately, Iowa-born Michelle Bachmann. Now, Michelle Bachmann, we've kind of seen where she stands on issues. Contrast her with someone like Brad Pitt, who is really, this is our example of the scary atheist. Brad Pitt has worked for years after the hurricane and the flood in New Orleans. He's a carpenter. He goes down there, volunteers his time. In fact, he's so popular in New Orleans that they have signs up saying, Brad Pitt for mayor. And Brad Pitt jokes, well, I can't be mayor of New Orleans because I'm an atheist. Well, why does that make any sense? Because I'd take Brad Pitt over Michelle Bachmann any day, and I'm not even a woman. I'm just saying, this is a decent guy who does decent things in an honorable way, and I think his way of looking at the world should be included along with other perspectives. Now, to principle number 9, which is so important to me. There will be one consistent standard pertaining to the health and welfare of children no matter the religion of the child's parents, school, or child care center. Religious extremists can do whatever they want with their own bodies, but children shall be treated as human beings, not sacrificed as pawns in the name of religion, like Jessica Crank was in the 21st century in this country. And I give many, many examples in my book of horrific situations for children based on religious bias in statute, not just religious attitude, not a fundamentalist attitude alone, but with the help of American law. Principle number 10, medical, technical, and scientific innovation shall be dedicated to the health and advancement of our fellow citizens and must never be impeded by religious bias. People who are facing Parkinson's disease, they need our help, they need our compassion, and more importantly, they need our science. They need the forward motion of the Enlightenment to help with these issues. People facing spinal cord injury, they can be helped by stem cell research, and we owe it to them to do the right thing and not have it blocked by fundamentalist religious bias. These 10 principles, I would submit to you, are principles that we can all stand together regarding. However, the fact of the matter is, if you look at a chapter in my book called The Fundamentalist 50, unfortunately you will find that there are theocrats. I'm not talking about merely Republicans. I'm talking about people who have a theocratic view of government, who are holding high elected office in this country. After the 2012 election, a lot of people said, well, everything's sweetness and light. The good guys won because Barack Obama was reelected. But when you go through the Fundamentalist 50, who are members of Congress in my book, either they're still there, or in the vast majority of cases, if they were replaced by someone just as theocratic as they were before them. So that's what we face, and it's widespread. Coming from 10 years in the legislature myself, I can tell you that's where a lot of the action was regarding how your day-to-day life is affected, is in those state capitals. And the control of those state capitals is largely theocratic. Now, when I speak on the coasts, sort of the snobbish coasts of this country, they'll say, well, that's just flyover country, if you will. But even that's not true. In fact, of the 10 most populated states in the country, 7 of the 10 have theocratic control of their state legislatures. That's what we're facing in this country. And I want to sort of take a step back and look at how we got there, because we didn't get that beautiful peace sign after the 2012 election. They are deeply embedded in the U.S. House, in the state legislatures, in the school boards, in the governor's mansions, and I want us to kind of look at how that came to be. Well, part of it has to do with something called money. This figure, $109 million. This is the cumulative budgets of organizations which specifically work for a theocratic viewpoint in American public policy. $109 million in the budgets of these organizations. But let's not stop there. You have $130 million in your peace pie chart. That would be focused on the family based in Colorado Springs. Again, focused on a theocratic approach to government. It doesn't stop there. Jerry Falwell, he may be gone. His organization and his empire is not gone. Over $400 million in annual budget going to religious propaganda, seeking theocratic law in this country. And then our friend, Mr. Robertson, even more money, over $400 million, going for a theocratic approach to society. And so, $1 billion devoted per year for the advocacy of a theocratic viewpoint in American society. A viewpoint that did not exist in the same way 40 years ago. In 1970, they counted the number of megachurches. Megachurches are defined as 2,000 on an average Sunday with an evangelical viewpoint. There were less than 100 of those evangelical megachurches in 1970 in the United States of America. Now there are hundreds upon hundreds of these churches. However, there is a change that I want to point out to folks, and that is that the fundamentalist viewpoint, evangelical is just a new marketing term for it. Billy Graham really popularized it when they found that fundamentalism wasn't working after the Scopes trials. But evangelicalism, fundamentalism, when you look at that demographic, it grew. It grew from around 1970 to 1990. They flatlined, really, from 1990. They maybe held their own. They haven't been growing significantly since 1990, the last 20 years. But you know who has grown is we've seen the secular American population growing very, very significantly, and therein lies an opportunity. An opportunity for people in this room to build an alliance between religious people who care about separation of church and state and non-religious people, because together we represent the majority of Americans, but we have not exercised our clout sufficient to our majority viewpoint. You have to give the religious right credit because they've been fighting above their weight class. At best, maybe they represent 20 to 25% of the U.S. population, yet you would think, based upon their veto power over the Republican Party, that it's almost in equipoise between fundamentalism and lack thereof, and that's just not true. So we need to make more effort to change things, because right now they're deeply embedded in government, and the problem is pervasive. Every one of the 10 areas I talked about, in the 10-point vision of secular America, unfortunately there are laws that violate the principles in that vision. And it's important because this vision is different than, I understand and respect the viewpoint, for instance, if let's say there's atheist activists that say we're against a memorial to the Holocaust where there's a Star of David with government money. I understand that on a legal basis. I'm an attorney. But frankly, in terms of communicating to a larger public, all of these 10 principles involve real people who are victims, who are harmed by some injustice. And it's religious bias not only in social, interpersonal attitudes, it's religious bias in law that we're talking about, and that religious bias in American law, which would be something that would be abhorrent to Jefferson and Madison, is justified in law by a religious viewpoint. So what I write about in my book is a strategy book. It's not a philosophy book. Whether you're religious or not religious is really irrelevant to the point of my book. This book is about my personal journey. It's about specific steps that we can take together. This book isn't about changing your view of the afterlife. It's about changing our world together in this life. And so, of course, you were going to ask me about Kentucky, because that's where I'm business. I have had a lot of luck in my life in that I've had some great opportunities to speak out on issues, serving 10 years in the legislature. I got to do the welcome for Barack Obama when he came in 2008 to my home state, primarily because I think most of the other Democrats were for Hillary at that time. I'll take it, whatever it was. And then I've been the opening speaker for Richard Dawkins on many occasions. And one that stands out was a time in rural Kentucky. As some of you may know, the big city of Kentucky is Louisville. This is a couple hours drive away from Louisville. A place called Eastern Kentucky University. I have to admit, I'd never heard of Eastern Kentucky University before I went there. The notice for it was nominal. We had an email. We had something on the university's website and on our website. 2,300 people showed up to see Richard Dawkins speak. And when I talked about this 10-point vision of a secular America before this crowd, we had them roaring, revival style, for a 10-point vision of a secular America. And these people were excited. They were very excited to see Richard Dawkins, but they were maybe even more excited to see each other, to see how many of them there were in Kentucky, where they were told, and we're told, this is the Bible Belt, this is the buckle of the Bible Belt. There isn't this kind of viewpoint here. Well, in fact, there is. And they were also pleased by the 10-point vision, I think, because it was something specific that they could sink their teeth into and say, here's something maybe I can do something about to make my world a better place. And so it really is an inspiration and an opportunity, because Richard Dawkins in person is a catalyst, but even more so, Richard Dawkins through social media. Our Facebook page is visited by millions. He's followed on Twitter, on website, YouTube channel, extremely popular, so you can communicate to millions very efficiently. You don't need to bring him physically to a location. The internet provides a tremendous opportunity for us that's unique within the secular movement. And so, I am going to move from Kentucky to Iowa and talk to you about where I think Iowa is central to the future of this country with regard to this church-state separation issue. Now, some of you, especially if you are either were of that generation or know your history, know about Jimmy Carter in Iowa. If Jack Kennedy, Dick Nixon, they didn't campaign in Iowa. Iowa caucuses were not prominent in their time. It was really Jimmy Carter in the early 1970s who brought in his peanut brigade to Iowa, infiltrated here, worked the volunteers, and got things going, got that victory, and then became the nominee and ultimately the President of the United States through strategy, a sort of subtle strategy here in the state of Iowa. And I think it has a parallel for us. But first, here's Jimmy Carter, the nuclear engineer. You know, of course, Michelle Bachmann, not the nuclear engineer. Here's Michelle Bachmann, and this is in summer. This is at your Iowa State Fair, summer of 2011. I want to note something about this besides the corn dog, and that is, look at the people behind her. Look at all those cameras. Now, was Michelle Bachmann ever seriously considered? I mean, she was an interesting candidate, you know, it was just for entertainment purposes, nothing else. But as far as people really thinking she was going to be the nominee, no, people did not really think she was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party, yet she has a crowd of reporters following her many, many months before the actual caucus date. You folks in Iowa live in a unique place. Thanks to Alan's leadership, I came to Iowa for the caucus process. And it was really remarkable to me because I go to some of these events and sit down next to somebody and say, "Hi, how you doing? Where are you from?" "Well, I'm from Spain. I'm a reporter from Spain, from Tokyo, from London, from New York, from Los Angeles." And frankly, when you pull all the media out of it, a lot of times these crowds weren't even that big when you counted actual supporters. There was so much darn media packed into the place. And I thought, geez, you know, this is not even as many sometimes as some of my state Senate kickoffs back home. What's up here? So the reporter to person or supporter ratio is like nothing else in any other part of the country, including New Hampshire. You folks have a unique situation here. And so in talking with Alan and talking with all of you, we thought, you know, these reporters are sort of a captive audience, and the press for a 9-month, 10-month, longer period is looking for a story. And we intend to give them one. And this is the story. The Get Religious Bias Out of Government campaign plan. I want to talk to you about how it works. We get commitment here on the ground from local people who say they'll be involved, they'll volunteer, they'll contribute. Here in Iowa, we will get Richard Dawkins here in 2014 and get you a 2,000+ person convention where we build a base of volunteers in the state of Iowa. And that base of volunteers in Iowa is critically important because they would be hosts. Hosts for people from all over the country. I've gone and tested this out in Oklahoma City, in Denver, and down in South Florida. And I gave speeches about this plan, about bringing people from all over the country, like Jimmy Carter did, except for not just from Georgia, from all over the United States, from secular groups, saying, let's get together in the state of Iowa. And, you know, I kind of made a joke about, you know, vacation to Floridians in Iowa. They laughed at me. By the end of my talk, the majority of the people in the room said, I will pay for my own plane ticket, I will come, and I will help campaigns to get religious bias out of government in the state of Iowa. We can do something exciting here if we have commitment from folks in Iowa. Because this is a collaboration nationally, and it's also a collaboration here. So we need liberal religious groups in Iowa, gay community folks in Iowa, civil liberties groups, secular education groups, women's rights groups saying, yes, we believe separation of church and state matters to us. We will help those people. We'll allow people to couch surf at our home or use the extra bedroom. We'll help coordinate. We'll help do phone calls. And I will work to bring people from Anchorage and Key West to Iowa to make sure that this gets going. So we're talking about having campaign staff in state that's working. While I'm working at a national level trying to bring people in, we have someone working in state coordinating these efforts through to the caucus date in January 2016. And then you have a continuous presence of a coordinated campaign of religious and non-religious people working together on these issues. We have an app that tells people, all right, here's where a campaign event is. A small, obscure campaign event is happening for some candidate. We show up. We show up with t-shirts that are coordinated with our yard signs, which are coordinated with our billboards that have this consistent message. We have a special turnout for the straw poll, for the state fair, for big events that happen in the state. But we have a steady presence. And given the numbers that we're talking about, if you have a decent flow, week by week by week, charted out by week of people that are wearing the same t-shirts, offering the same message, and having a disciplined approach, so that we are talking about this 10-point vision. We're not arguing about religion or not religion. We're talking about getting religious bias out of government. Then that's a broad coalition and a focused message that I think will be really successful for all of us working together. And then we'll have celebrities come in. For those who, young people will know the show Mythbusters. I talked to Adam Savage directly about this, and he said, I will volunteer my time and come in. So we'll get him and other celebrities to come to Iowa to help participate in this effort. But it really needs to be Iowa as the leaders, as the collaborative, so that we have local people, local groups saying they're going to help host this throughout these months. When I'm going to say to folks in Connecticut, okay, Connecticut, you got this week and a half, and then there's got to be people here in Iowa to help direct them and work with them on the ground. Next is that this 10-point vision is not a set of argument points. It's a set of persuasion points. We're talking to friends, we're talking to neighbors, and we're explaining to them about injustice in law. So it's not a philosophical or religious debate. We can keep our message focused to that, whether we come from the religious community or the non-religious community. So when I talk about Iowa, I got people in Florida saying, Iowa makes the heart beat faster, and I think it will because we are going to make America a better place and do something historic. And I really think we need that. It'll be a fun time. It'll be a party. We'll have a big event next year. People like Adam Savage coming. It'll be a great time to have all these people visiting from other states and share these values. So I think that would be fantastic. But the most important thing is the strategic message and goal. That we capture the imagination and attention of the media about an organized and articulate and diverse counterbalance to the religious right that shows people who support church-state separation of all stripes, religious and non-religious, working together as a team. And I tell you, that's a story the media will be interested in. Because they've seen, the media has seen, how powerful the religious right is and is perceived. And if they see there's a real solid counterbalance, an organized counterbalance, they will cover that story. It's also, I think, something important for Iowa. It's a chance to say who Iowa is. Because I have to report to you, as an out-of-stater from Iowa, that despite what I think is a great noble heritage of this state, that, for a lot of people, because of his volatile statements, it's the state of Steve King. He gets in the media so much with the kind of things that he says. And we need to say, that's not what Iowa is really about. We're more the state of Norman Borlaug. We're the people who, as Norman Borlaug did, use science and reason to do something that saved millions upon millions, or perhaps even more than 1 billion lives. That's a noble heritage. It includes religious people, but it also includes people like, say, Iowa-born Johnny Carson, who did not happen to be religious, who was a decent, honorable man, and went out and debunked people who were shysters and grifters using his comedy to do so. Another decent, honorable man is your neighbor just down the road a piece, Warren Buffett, who really is a logical guy. And I think he shouldn't have it held against him that Warren Buffett does not happen to be religious. So we have this team working together on these values. And I think that will really bring us back to what Iowa is really about. Iowa, as you know, was the state that took the lead in helping with equality for African Americans, took the lead in working for equality for women, has really had a dramatic step forward for people in the LGBT community. So that's the Iowa that really should be known to the rest of the world. And this great next step could be something Iowa can do that could change American history for the better. And I hope that you can do it. Because if the religious right can organize for intolerance and injustice, we can organize together for science and reason and compassion and for a better America. But I need your specific help as the leaders in Iowa to help make this happen. I thank you for hearing me out and having answered the question.
Before we take questions, a couple of quick announcements. We have a sign-up sheet. If you want to get more information about this, if you want to get involved, if you want to be on our email list, it's going to be, at the end of the thing, we'll have a table over there with some.
Yeah, so we can pass it
around right now.
Yeah.
The other thing is, we have a regular organizational meeting about to work on this, which is the last Thursday of each month. We may change that because I just got out Friday that it's the same evening as the Interfaith Alliance board meeting. This month we actually have a speaker. It's going to be Matt McCoy, who's going to come and talk about how religious bias is affecting the state legislature and laws that they have. And that's at Felix Noska's on Myrtle Hay at 6 o'clock on the last Tuesday of the month, which is a week from this Tuesday, so 9 days from now. Please come and join us. And then also one other announcement that we don't know the location and the exact time yet, but on Tuesday, October 1st, we're going to be having the plaintiff in the case that was settled in the Supreme Court 50 years ago, Elry Shem, who is the case that stopped prayer in school. And just a quick aside to wet your whistle, the reason he was expelled from school for when the students were required to read prayer in class, he read the prayer from the Quran, and he was expelled from school, and that's what led to the case. So anyway, now I'll turn it back over to Sean.
I got a few words too.
Sure.
Sean is exactly right. I'm John Friedel. I'm president of Iowa Atheist and Freethinkers. And about 20 of us protested Bob Vanderplaat's event last Saturday where Rick Santorum, Steve King, Ted Cruz, and Lord help me, Donald Trump all spoke. And I'd say, what do you say, guys? About five? I'd say about 5 reporters came up, NBC News, Washington Post, Dallas News, and 3 or 4 others to talk to us. And even Steve King himself came over and visited with us. He said, what are we doing? You know, he wasn't arguing with us, he just wanted to see what we were up to. So it's working. Sean is absolutely right. The media loves it, and we really should take advantage of it.
Actually, one other thing there are a couple more events that are coming up that we are going to do protests also, and the best way to find out what we're doing is meetup.com, meetup.com.
Get your emails on there.
A lot of the emails will let you know.
Would you say that again?
meetup.com, meetupcom, absolutely free. And there's, you either look at the Iowa Atheist and Freethinker site or the Iowa Skeptic site, a page on it, and you'll get all these events will be listed on both. So with that, feel free to
Let me ask questions.
When was the event in Kentucky you referred to?
Oh, when was it? Let's see, I think it was 2011 or something.
Oh, just recent, real recent.
Oh yeah, it was definitely the last 2 years.
One other announcement. Sean and a bunch of us are going to have lunch at Java Joe's. We'll be there about 12:30. Anyone is welcome to join us today. So if you want to come and talk some more after this, please come to Java Joe's at 12:30.
Yeah.
It's, I know we're talking about elective office, but it seems to me that we also have a problem with the interpretation of the Constitution at the Supreme Court level, but I think there's a tremendous amount of religious bias if you look at the religious makeup of the members of the court. That's why it's imperative that you have a president that has the ability to appoint. That's one of the legacies of George Bush, is the people that he put on there. And he put on a young man to be chief, and he's going to be around for a long time.
No question. I'm not going to say there's some magic way to change what was successful on the part of the religious right, which was to get a lot of their folks appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. What I think that we need to do that they did successfully is focus on what we can do. I can't change for you the Supreme Court right away, but if we work our way up, I think we can change that eventually by doing these kind of grassroots effort. You know, the religious right, if you went back to the 1960s and asked most people whether they were Republican or Democrat, and said, what's the clout of the fundamentalist, evangelical movement, whatever you want to call it, they would say 0, because it really wasn't significant. They did an intelligent grassroots effort focusing on things like the school boards, the state legislatures, and I think that's pivotally important. But also they created a movement, and that's really what I'm talking about here today, and I hope everyone will sign up on that sheet that's going around, is that, so keep it moving along and sign on, is that we need people showing up and really here, because Iowa is such a pivot point, because you have this unique opportunity, you can have outsized impact. You know, if we get hundreds doing something, that'll have a lot more impact than hundreds doing it in New York or California. And especially because the media comes to you. They're sitting ducks, if you will, for many months. And I think that we can be very successful based on sort of like test marketing of this concept in Florida, Oklahoma, and Colorado, that people, if they get the sense that they really can do something substantive, they will participate. But the yin and the yang of it is we need Iowans. We need Iowans that say, we're ready, we're organized, we will work with you, and we're going to hire professionals too, but we need that volunteer base, pivotally so. Yeah.
Are there any specific focuses or foci that we should have in terms of where the weak points are in the all of this religious rights legislative?
Well, I think it's important, that's sort of the strategy of the 10-point vision, is to give specifics, stay focused on those specifics, but also to show the pervasiveness. And let me explain why that's important. 2 of the 10 points of the 10-point vision of a secular America are ones that I'll say are sort of parlance in the mall. That is, if you went down to the mall and said, well, what's the religious right against? Most people, I hope, would say, all right, well, there's the issue of equality for gay people, that they would know that issue. And there's the issue of women's reproductive issues. And those are 2 of the 10 points. But what a lot of people don't know, and in fact a lot of secular people don't know, or liberal religious people don't know, is about these 8 additional areas of law. So you can say, did you know this about land use planning when a megachurch sued in Boulder County, Colorado, and won to exempt themselves from the green space law, and everybody else has to obey the green space law, but they don't. They can build their parking lots or do whatever it is they want to do because of this top-down federal mandate that specifically relates to religion. Most people have never heard of this. Most people have never heard that there's states where they say, all right, in religious child cares, and this is, unlike child protection, this is minority states, but still a significant minority, where they can say, oh, you're religious child care, you don't have to obey the health and safety laws that other child cares have to obey. We're talking about 2, 3, 4-year-olds, most vulnerable people, who are sometimes placed in situations of serious jeopardy, purely because of a flat-out religious bias in statute. So the point is, the strategy is to kind of say, did you know about these many varieties of ways? And frankly, Leah, the criticism, I don't know if you're a regular here at the Unitarian Church, or whether you're with one of the atheist groups, but frankly, one of my criticisms of the atheist community is where I might agree with them on a technical point as a lawyer. I disagree strategically that we should be putting so much media attention into whether there's a manger in the town square at Christmas time. I personally don't think that should happen. If I were a judge, I would disagree with Justice Roberts and remove it. But I don't think it works as strategically well as these other human impact issues. So that, I think, is a key point. And also, I think there's sort of a societal tipping point strategy that's even more important than that. That if you have these people showing up on a regular basis, there's some relatively minor candidate, but the press is there following them, and there's 5 or 10 of us with these t-shirts saying, get religious bias out of government. If it's done well, it actually can be done efficiently to say, wow, there's a whole different viewpoint out here, an organized viewpoint. And right now, people think that religious right owns the field almost when it comes to religious viewpoint in politics. And I think maybe even the biggest thing we can do is to create that perception that, oh, there's this organized counterbalance.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Given all the resources that you've listed for the fundamentalists and the legislative power, how do you explain the progress of gay rights in light of that?
Well, I think they did fantastically well also. I'll just give you an anecdote, if you will, from my own history. When I was a young pup out of law school, I was legal counsel to the state senate in my home state. And I remember back in those days, we're talking about the late 80s, among the Democrats, forget the Republicans, among the Democrats, there was kind of an arm's length relationship to the gay community, kind of like, hello, gay person, maybe friendly to you. The Democrats, they were working on it, but it was a stretch for the organizational Democrats. And the Republicans, of course, would rush to condemn them. They would rush. They couldn't say fast enough how much they would condemn gay people. And what I saw from the LGBT community was they showed up. They kept showing up. And they'd show up at the Democratic functions and say, well, I'm going to help out at the supper for the Democratic whatever, and I'm going to participate in this, and we're going to organize this event. And piece by piece by piece, they sort of became organizationally accepted. I'm talking more about the Democratic side. And then, as you got through the 90s, it it became for the Democrats where, when I was an elected official myself, where Democrats would affirmatively seek out to have support from the gay community. I think we can do the same thing, especially if we're willing to broaden the tent. Because in the past, it seems to me you had a great group, Interfaith Alliance, which is a fantastic organization, and that organization did very, very good things in Washington, D.C. And then you've had kind of secular and atheist groups, which frankly haven't been organized enough. But they've been growing in terms of numbers a lot, and they haven't organized sociologically enough. And I'm saying if you took those two groups and started to say, we may not agree on, who created the universe, but we agree on what happens in terms of the U.S. Constitution. We are the powerhouse, and we let ourselves be the powerhouse. But it does mean taking that time, because again, taking the page from folks in the gay community, they were, tilling in what seemed like a pretty dry field for a long time. In the 70s and 80s, it must have been, it's going to be pretty tough. And I think sometimes people who come from a secular perspective sometimes feel like throwing up your hands and let's just say we dislike everybody. And I think the opposite. Let's build a bridge with the interfaith community that does care about church-state separation. And also that strategy from Jimmy Carter is sort of work our way up. Also to add to that, I think just for a strategy for us, is the gay community starting to build their way up in money. They start to say, all right, I'm going to contribute money, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to be involved financially. And I think we need to do that. This is going to cost. This whole thing, it's not free. We've got national staff, state staff, billboards. The whole total budget for this is approaching $1 million. This isn't cheap. We need people here to invest in that. Now, it's relatively small, as I pointed out in my slides, compared to what the other folks are spending. But I think that's the beauty of this concept, is that a relatively small expenditure of dollars, although for me that's a lot of money, but still a relatively small expenditure of dollars could get us a big bang for the media buck. Yes.
I just want to mention also that in this past legislative session, point 8 was completely attacked by the religious right. As you would know, the legislative session lasted 3 weeks longer than it was supposed to. It was because the religious right would not allow the budget to go through until the legislature did 3 things related to education. One, that the parochial schools do not have to follow state standards. They're able to follow one of 3 parochial standards, which 2 of those 3 do not require teaching evolution. And the second one was that homeschool kids did not have to take standardized tests in the state of Iowa. All the parents have to do is sign a affidavit saying that my student is learning what they need to learn.
Or driver's education.
And the third one was the driver's education. The parents can do driver's education and just sign an affidavit that I gave my student driver's education, which means the student gets lower insurance rates and can drive a year earlier without having taken the formal driver's education course. So I hope the insurance companies fight against that. So this is happening in Iowa. This isn't an abstract thing from around the country.
Did they pass those?
They passed it. Basically, Senator Slocum was at Interfaith Alliance in June, and he said we had a choice of going back 2 years in how much the schools were getting, which would have been a 10% cut in the real budget in the Iowa schools, or we could throw 3% of the students under the bus to make sure the 97% have what they had, and that was his words. So the legislature threw 3% of the students getting religious education in the state under the bus to protect the education for the other 97% in public education.
That's a sheep.
She. Yep, sorry.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am?
I want to testify to the effectiveness of your method of activism during the caucus. Years ago, when the governor of New Mexico was here campaigning before the caucus, I happened to hear him over at Central College, and he was way off base on agriculture, so I spoke up. Right afterwards, I get interviewed by a reporter from somewhere. I tell him more what I know. And some months later, because I happened to Google up my own name, here I'm quoted, the silver-haired lady in Iowa, and all I said with a good headline. So
And that's exactly right. The odds of doing what you did are so much higher in Iowa than any other place in the union. So we have a huge opportunity. We can cultivate speakers also for this. I should just introduce Professor Hector Avalos from Iowa State, who wrote a great book, by the way, that I read about violence early years in the church. Maybe you can press it like that. But I use some quotes from his book for speeches I've given, and he is an Iowa expert on some issues. We also have local elected officials that will speak out for separation of church and state. And so when we go to a campaign in 2015, my goal is that I'll certainly go out and speak and try to get people to participate in this process, but I want to see a lot of local people speaking out, so when, as inevitably would happen, we get attacked as these terrible out-of-staters who are coming here, there'll be someone who says, I'm a local professor, I'm a local elected official, and importantly for folks in this room, we need local clergy, Iowa clergy that will get up and say, I am for separation of church and state. They've got reverend in front of their name or rabbi in front of their name, and they stand side by side with us and make their position clear that they want religious bias out of government too. And I think that will have a huge impact, that local, prominent Iowa voice, especially from the religious community. Yeah, that's all. Go ahead.
Have you contacted Amos?
Not yet, that's high on my list. Yes.
Okay. Just for your, this church is very active in Amos, which is a mid-Iowa organizing strategy, and the members of Amos are 28 churches in central Iowa, and they have connections, a network all over the state of Iowa, and they are very powerful.
Yeah, and that's the type of group we'd like to involve. And also, when the Iowa sees specific names, we'll have an advisory board, and that advisory board needs to have Reverend Jones, Rabbi Smith, whatever, so that they're included as well. Yeah.
Yeah, two things. One, Dr. Alvarez's point about the gay movement getting steam. Part of that was not just big people, but everyday people saying,
Yes.
I'm gay. So that we knew gay people and
Right.
it became more okay. And I think for all of us, even little people like me, coming out of the woodwork and saying, geez, really bothers me, this religious bias in our law. But for that was sake, it becomes more politically correct. But the main thing I wanted to ask about, I am not a person who wants to go out and protest a group. I don't want to do that. And my impression of the work your group is going to be doing is more speaking up for changes, but not necessarily doing protests. Can you just explain to us a little more? All these people coming from out of state.
There might be situations where you would have what you might call a protest, like what John was describing, but something very important that we would do that I wouldn't describe as a protest is you show up, the candidate's at the coffee shop, and the media is there watching the candidate at the coffee shop. We have 5, 10, 15, 20, however many we can muster, wearing the same t-shirt with an organized message, and we say, candidate Smith, here's our question about separation of church and state. Maybe you take one of the points from the 10-point vision, or maybe you make a more global point about it, but you're asking and saying, here's my viewpoint. I hope you share my viewpoint. And really pushing the issue in a forceful but polite way. Also, we need people who would organize, certainly maybe most importantly, people who physically show up at these kinds of events. But also, we need people who are going to say, all right, I'm going to do the phone banking for this. I'm going to do data entry for this. I'm going to help work when we bring bus in people from Omaha, Kansas City, Minneapolis, all Denver. We're going to help with all the kind of logistics. This is a major event. I don't know if anybody here attended the Reason Rally, but I think of this as sort of a Reason Rally stretched over 9 months. And it requires more coordination, but it also, I think, can have potentially a higher political impact. Yeah.
I was at the protest last week, which was interesting. One of the things that brought our friend Steve King over to us, I was holding a sign that says, intolerance is not our family value. And I think it's important I thought it was important to start getting signs that say things other than separate church and state, which we also had, but get brief messages out there that say other things too that are important, like are perhaps in this book. But to refer to something you were saying about not wanting to protest but get involved, there's a lot of areas you can get involved with. It was my first protest that I went to. And you're inundated with people, and you need to have the knowledge and wisdom of what they're saying. I was raised in a fundamentalist church all my life. I majored in religion in college. I'm gay. I have a partner. I'm still a member of a liberal church, United Church of Christ. There's a lot of areas where you can witness. If the fundamentalists are going to witness as hard as they do, I think we should witness somehow. So most of my friends are Wiccan and atheists and other Christians and free thinkers. And what are we trying to do in this world, in this country, is to bring people together for what's fair for everybody. So there are ways you can witness just like the other side does. So I would say get involved. I swore I would never get involved with any group. I'm semi-retired from Texas, moved to New Mexico, and been working here 2 years. And I had no idea that Iowa was so busy and so important in politics. And I want to know, does my driver's license need to still say Texas or New Mexico, where I moved to and retired because I want to be in the mountains? And my studies in Native American culture, because that's part of my heritage, is Native American as well. Or do I keep my driver's license here in Iowa? Where can I be the most effective? And I did not think I was going to get involved.
Great. Help me. Great. We want you.
A conversation with these,
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
no, I'm going to
Yes.
do it.
Oh, you want me to do
Yes,
it?
yeah.
Well, there was a faithful person who came up and, we're there for separation of church and state was why we were there. Atheists, Christians, free thinkers, everyone. And a lot of people want to come up and debate you about Jesus and Muslims and all sorts of things. We're there for a message of separation of church and state. Not there to debate anything else unless you want to do it on your free time over on the corner. But a guy walked up and he was arguing that if I'm a Christian and I believe in the authority of Jesus Christ, that to be gay and to want separation of church and state was not Christian. Well, we ended up on YouTube because I said, what? You can't cherry pick your sins. So it was interesting that it was noted that, gee, here's two Christians and they're arguing. There are things we need to stand for, and I feel like I finally have a real call. And I'm going to buy your book.
So thank you. Well, we need to have you involved to take a lead in this. You're speaking. Although, when you talk, we should wrap up. Although I will say, when people talk about the cherry picking, it always gets me back home in Maine. There are all these folks who be saying, gay people, they're terrible, and blah, 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 blah. And I always used to like to quote back home in Maine, they have that prohibition in Leviticus about shellfish, which you kill our lobster.
There's also, we're not supposed to weave wool and cotton together. Women cannot speak up. Shellfish can't handle things that are pork. They're pig skin. They're worried about
maybe
gays.
our last question, and then I'm happy to sign books, and we'll see you at lunch if you want to over there.
Hi there. I was born and raised Muslim, and it never ceased to baffle me. And I came here as an undergraduate student, and one has to read the Constitution of your wonderful country to see how your founding fathers avoided so hard, worked so hard to get God out of the Constitution, and yet I want to know how this happened, how your religious rights invaded the Constitution.
Well, politicians want to get elected, and if they think that it's going to help them, I think a lot of times they will say what needs to be said, and especially in response to an organized group, and the religious right is an organized group. And partly I think it's incumbent upon us to be an organized group that thus politicians must respond to. Because if you're the average politician, I always think politicians think in two, mathematically, they think in two sets of numbers of dollars and numbers of people. And if you don't have the numbers of dollars and the numbers of people, they politely shake your hand and move on to the next person who does have numbers of dollars and numbers of people. And that's where we need to be headed. And this effort is really using a relatively modest numbers of dollars. So we think have a big impact on numbers of people by using sort of the megaphone of the media here in the state of Iowa. So I'm happy to answer questions further individually. Sign books and I see you over the And that sign-up sheet, I hope it's made it all the way around.
Good.
Okay, great.